On a blistering afternoon, a racist cop shackles a black woman to his cruiser and drags her across searing asphalt, her screams echoing down Main Street. Blood darkens the road. He smirks, unaware her husband is coming, and what happens next will turn the whole town into a battlefield. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The morning sun stretched across the small southern town like warm honey, spilling gold over rooftops and cobblestone sidewalks. The air was gentle, touched by the faint perfume of magnolias and the sweet, yeasty scent drifting from Miller's Bakery on the corner. The church bell chimed 9 times, each note carrying softly through the quiet streets, mixing with the sound of a distant lawnmower and the lazy chirp of sparrows on a telephone wire. It was the kind of morning that seemed built for peace, the kind where time felt slower and the day ahead promised nothing more than the rhythm of routine. Amara Lewis walked along Main Street with a brown paper bag nestled in her arms, its top folded neatly over, still warm from the bakery's oven. A small bouquet of parsley peeked out from the top, alongside a loaf of bread wrapped in paper, the smell so inviting she had to fight the urge to tear off a piece right there on the sidewalk. She moved with the calm confidence of someone who knew every crack in the pavement, every face behind every window. Her dark curls caught the sunlight in flashes, and when she passed the old iron gate where Mrs. Carter tended her roses, she slowed with a warm smile. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," Amara called, her voice light. The older woman looked up from pruning shears and beamed. "Morning, baby. You look like sunshine carrying groceries." Amara laughed softly, shaking her head. "It's just bread and greens today, but I'll take the compliment." She kept walking, her steps measured, savoring the quiet. The town's early hours were her favorite, the world still waking, the noise and rush not yet pressing in. The sound of her sandals brushing the pavement was almost meditative, until something new entered the air. A low hum, deep and mechanical, rolled from around the corner. It was distant at first, weaving into the backdrop of birdsong and breeze, but it grew steadily louder, heavier. She felt it before she saw it, the faint vibration of tires rolling slow over uneven asphalt. Then it appeared. A white police cruiser turning onto Main Street, sunlight bouncing off its spotless hood, its approach deliberate. The hum deepened as it closed in. Not the brisk drive of someone on a call, but the slow, prowling crawl of someone with time to look. The cruiser drew alongside her, matching her pace. Its shadow stretched long across the sidewalk, swallowing her feet in its reach. Her smile faded, replaced by a stillness in her face. She glanced sideways through the tinted window. A shape moved inside, then the mechanical whir of glass lowering broke the air. The window slid down with a slow, grinding sound, and the face that emerged was one Amara had seen before, though not often up close. Officer Warren Pike. Mid-40s, the kind of weathered skin that spoke of years under a relentless sun, but without the softness of kindness to temper it. His pale blue eyes seemed to blink less than they should, as if every glance was meant to pin something, or someone, in place. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, scanning the bag in her arms, then her face, then back to the bag. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural, and Amara felt it pressing against her chest. Finally, his voice broke through, sharp enough to slice the morning calm. "Where'd you get that?" His chin lifted slightly toward the bag, the movement small but loaded with ownership, as though her groceries were somehow his to question. Amara shifted the bag in her arms, adjusting her grip. "From the bakery and market," she answered, her tone steady, polite. "Is there a problem, officer?" The word officer was habit. Her mother had taught her long ago that titles could sometimes smooth the edges of a situation. But Pike's expression didn't shift. "I think you took something that doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice flatter now, no hint of curiosity. Only accusation. Heat rose under her skin, though the morning was still cool. "I paid for my groceries," she replied, the steadiness still there but tighter now, less like politeness and more like resolve. Without a word, Pike swung open the cruiser's door and stepped out. His boots hit the pavement with a deliberate thud, each step toward her echoing in the space between them. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint sheen of sweat across his forehead. Then, without asking, he reached out and grabbed the paper bag from her arms. The motion was quick, almost casual, but the roughness of it jolted her. One of the oranges slipped free, rolling across the sidewalk with a hollow bounce before disappearing into the gutter. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the street's quiet. Across the way, a curtain shifted in a window. Another, farther down, moved too. Neighbors were watching, but no one stepped outside. No one called out. Ike glanced down at the orange in the gutter, then back at her, his lip curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You people never learn," he said, the words low but slicing clean through the air. The words hung there, heavy and poisonous, sinking into the space between them. Amara felt them settle in her bones, not as something surprising, but as something all too familiar. The breeze that had been drifting gently down Main Street seemed to falter, as if even the air was holding still to listen. Her fingers curled at her sides, nails pressing into her palms. She could feel the thud of her own heartbeat, the heat in her cheeks building under Pike's steady, unblinking gaze. She thought of answering, thought of telling him just how wrong he was, but in the stillness, she knew it wouldn't matter. He wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for an excuse. Across the street, Mrs. Carter's roses bobbed gently in the wind, their deep red blooms bright against the white picket fence. Mrs. Carter was still by her gate, pruning shears hanging loose in her hand, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding just a few yards away. Their gazes met for a split second, and in that moment, Amara saw the hesitation there, the pull between wanting to help and the fear of stepping into the path of a bad. Pike shifted the paper bag in his hand, looking down at it with mock consideration before letting it hang slack at his side. The loaf of bread tilted inside, pressing against the folded edge of the bag like it was about to spill. "You think I don't see," he said quietly, almost conversational, but the weight in his tone made every word land like a strike. "Walking around like you own the place, carrying things that don't belong to you, thinking no one will say a thing." Her jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "I paid for what I bought." His eyes narrowed, a flash of something sharper than annoyance crossing them. He took a small step forward, so close now that she could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the crease between his brows etched deep from years of scowling. "Funny thing," he said, his breath warm with the scent of coffee. "I didn't ask if you paid. I said it didn't belong to you." The morning's golden calm was gone now. Main Street felt different, charged, watchful. Curtains twitched in two more windows. A shadow moved behind the glass door of the hardware store. No one spoke, but the silence had its own noise, thick with the unspoken truth that everyone understood. This was no misunderstanding about groceries. This was something deeper, something uglier, and it was just beginning. Pike's hand moved before Amara could step back. The metallic flash of the handcuffs caught the sunlight, momentarily blinding her as he snapped one cold band around her wrist. The bite of the steel was immediate, cutting into her skin with a sharp pressure that made her flinch. The second cuff closed just as quick, the click of the lock echoing louder than it should have in the quiet street. She twisted instinctively, trying to turn toward him, but his grip was iron, forcing her arms behind her back until her shoulders strained. The paper bag lay forgotten at their feet, the bread half spilled, parsley scattered in the wind. "Officer, this isn't necessary," she said, her voice trembling but still holding a thread of control. Pike didn't answer. He shoved her toward the rear of the cruiser, his boots hitting the pavement in slow, deliberate rhythm. She stumbled once, catching herself before falling, the cuffs biting deeper into her wrists. When they reached the back of the car, he popped the trunk halfway open, revealing the inside frame. Without ceremony, he hooked the chain between her cuffs to a metal rail just below the latch. The sharp clink of the connection sent a jolt through her chest. "Please," she said, this time louder, the cracks in her voice showing now. "Don't do this. I haven't done anything wrong." Her words seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat before being drowned out by the slam of the trunk closing over the chain. The impact rattled through her arms. He walked around to the driver's seat, moving with the unhurried gait of someone in complete control. She felt the shift in the cruiser's weight as he settled in. Then came the turn of the ignition, the low, rumbling growl of the engine vibrating through the frame, up her arms, into her bones. She took a deep breath, bracing herself without fully knowing why, but the first lurch forward still nearly ripped her off her feet. Her toes scraped against the pavement as she struggled to keep up. The cuffs pulled hard against her wrists with every inch of movement, the chain jerking with the cruiser's momentum. In the first few steps, the soles of her sandals began to scrape away, the thin leather tearing under the abrasive kiss of the asphalt. Heat radiated upward, and she realized with a sudden spike of fear that the sun-baked street was already burning through to her skin. The cruiser picked up just enough speed to make every step a desperate scramble. Amara's sandals tore completely, straps snapping and dangling as she lost them, leaving the bare skin of her feet to meet the coarse, blistering pavement. Each step was agony, heat searing into her soles, grit grinding into tender flesh. She tried to match the pull of the chain, her breath coming in sharp bursts, but the car didn't slow. The cuffs wrenched at her wrists with each jolt, metal cutting deeper as the links rattled and bit into bone. Her shoulders ached, her knees already stinging from the first stumble, thin fabric no match for the rough surface. "Stop! Please stop!" she shouted, her voice raw, breaking with the strain. The wind tore the words from her mouth before they could reach him. Up ahead, a man stood frozen on his porch, hands gripping the railing. A phone glinted in his palm. For a moment she thought he might step forward. Instead, he lifted the phone slowly, tilting it just enough for the lens to catch her, not to help, but to record. Two more faces appeared in windows. One held a curtain back, the other barely visible behind the glare. None moved. The sound of the engine swallowed the quiet street, a low, steady roar that pressed against her ears. Her feet began to slip on the slick patches of melted tar, each one threatening to send her to her knees. When it happened, it was sudden. The chain jerked forward, and she hit the ground hard. The first impact shredded through the thin cotton of her dress at the knees, skin tearing instantly. The burn of raw asphalt ignited up her legs. She pushed up, hands bound, wrists screaming against the cuffs, the weight of the moving cruiser forcing her into a half-run, half-crawl. The air shimmered in the summer heat, the buildings around her blurring at the edges. The sharp taste of copper filled her mouth, and she realized she'd bitten her tongue. Every muscle in her body begged her to stop, but stopping meant being dragged entirely, skin against scorching ground, no way to shield herself. She forced her legs to move, the sound of her own ragged breathing mixing with the rhythmic hum of the tires. Ahead, the street seemed endless, stretching into waves of heat. Somewhere behind the sound of the engine, a voice was calling her name. Faint, urgent, but she couldn't turn to look. The sun bore down with an almost punishing weight, its light bouncing off the pale concrete until the street itself seemed to glow. The air shimmered, and the line where the road met the horizon blurred into a molten haze. Each breath Amara took felt hotter than the one before, like inhaling air straight from an open oven. The glare was unyielding, stabbing into her eyes no matter how much she tried to turn her head away. Her lashes clumped with sweat and every blink stung. The pull of the cruiser was constant, cruel in its steadiness. The chain bit into her wrists without pause, the metal growing hotter with every second under the sun. She could feel the cuffs pressing into bone, the sharp edge of each link carving its mark into her skin. Her shoulders screamed from the strain, a deep ache setting in as her arms were stretched into a position they weren't meant to endure. She stumbled again, catching herself only halfway before her knee struck the pavement. This time the skin didn't just scrape, it tore. The sting was immediate, a sharp burn that deepened into a throb with each new step. The thin fabric of her dress clung to the wound, and she could feel it tugging each time her leg moved, as though the road itself was trying to claim her. She became aware of another sound beneath the roar of the engine, a faint, irregular patter. It took her a moment to realize it was the sound of her own blood dripping onto the road, each drop absorbed instantly by the heat-baked asphalt. The thought rooted itself in her mind, heavy and surreal. She was leaving a trail behind her, marking the path of her humiliation for the entire town to see. From the corner of her vision, a figure appeared. A man stood in his yard, one hand gripping the latch of a low gate. His face was shadowed under the brim of a cap, but she could see his mouth open, could almost imagine the words forming there. For a moment, she believed he might step forward, might cut across the yard and put himself between her and the cruiser. But the moment passed. The latch clicked shut, and he was gone from sight, swallowed by the shadows of his porch. She forced her legs to keep moving. Her feet were a mess of raw skin and grit now, every step a white-hot spike of pain radiating upward. She could feel the heat rising from the road, wrapping around her calves in suffocating waves. It was the kind of pain that made her want to collapse, to curl in on herself and block out the world, but the chain gave her no choice. The sound of the engine grew louder in her head until it wasn't just in front of her, it was inside her. She felt it in her ribs, in her jaw, in the base of her skull. It drowned out everything else, a steady mechanical growl that left no room for thought. And then, through that roar, came something else, a voice, distant at first, almost lost in the heat and noise, but there. Her name, called in a tone that was more than just urgent. It was raw, pulled from the depths of someone's chest. Amara! Her heart jolted at the sound. She tried to lift her head, but the glare of the sun hit her full in the face, forcing her eyes closed again. Her mind grasped for the voice, tried to hold onto it like a rope. It came again, louder this time, closer. But every time it rose above the din, the engine seemed to answer, swallowing it whole in a wash of mechanical growls. She wanted to answer, to let him know she heard him. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. Her voice was gone, stolen by the dryness in her throat, the heat that scorched her lungs, and the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her body felt heavier now, each step dragging her closer to collapse. Her wrists throbbed in time with her heartbeat, the pain sharpest where the cuffs had begun to break the skin. Her knees threatened to buckle again, the thought of falling full length onto the road haunting her with every forward pull. Somewhere behind her, the voice shouted her name again, but now it was joined by another sound. The pounding of footsteps. Quick, heavy, closing the distance. She wanted to turn, wanted to see him, but the chain jerked hard, snapping her forward. The cruiser didn't stop. It didn't even slow. The sun seemed to press lower, the street narrowing in her vision. She realized with a kind of detached clarity that she didn't know how much farther she could go. Each breath came shallow now. Each step felt like it might be her last. And somewhere in the space between the engine's roar and the sound of approaching footsteps, the edges of the world began to blur. And still, the chain pulled her on. The roar of the cruiser's engine finally cut off, the sudden silence almost dizzying after the relentless pull. Amara barely registered the moment she stopped moving. Her knees buckled, her body sagging forward against the chain that still tethered her to the trunk. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps, every muscle trembling from the strain. Somewhere in the distance, tires screeched. The sound was sharp, urgent, closer with each second until it seemed to crash directly into the stillness. A dark blue pickup barreled into view, braking hard just behind the cruiser. The The door swung open before the vehicle had fully settled, and Marcus Lewis was already moving. He hit the pavement in long, ground-eating strides, boots striking hard enough to echo off the shop fronts. The heat rolled off the asphalt in waves, but he didn't slow. Marcus reached her in seconds, dropping to his knees without hesitation. His arms came around her, the familiar scent of motor oil and steel clinging to his shirt, now mixed with the sharp tang of blood rising from her skin. He pulled her in, supporting her weight with a steady strength that made her feel momentarily lighter, though pain still flared in every nerve. "Amara," he said, his voice low and tight, as if speaking louder might shatter her. She blinked up at him, her vision clouded, trying to focus on the familiar lines of his face. His eyes scanned her quickly, the way a soldier takes in a battlefield. Fast, precise, noting every injury, every mark, every cut. The sight carved something deep into him, but he kept his jaw clenched. Over her shoulder, Marcus saw him. Officer Warren Pike stood a few feet away, just beyond the shadow of the cruiser, arms crossed, his expression unreadable except for the faint upward twitch at the corner of his mouth. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He only watched. Marcus's eyes locked on Pike's, the space between them tightening like a drawn wire. There were no words, none were needed. In that gaze, there was no question, no plea for understanding. There was only a promise. Amara's lips parted, as if she were trying to say something, the faintest movement against his shoulder. He leaned closer, his ear almost brushing her mouth, but the sound that came out was barely more than breath. He caught fragments, maybe a name, maybe just the broken edge of a word, before her head tilted back slightly, her body going limp in his arms. Marcus's hold tightened, his pulse steadying not from peace, but from the clarity of knowing exactly what had to come next. Marcus shifted his grip, one arm under Amara's knees and the other bracing her back, lifting her fully off the ground, the chain still pulled taut from her wrists to the cruiser's trunk, a cold, unyielding tether that refused to release her. He set her gently down for just a moment, the motion careful despite the tension in his body, and reached for the cuffs. The steel was biting into her skin, the flesh beneath them raw and darkened. He tugged once, hard, but the metal didn't give. Pike had locked them tight, the key nowhere in sight. Marcus straightened, turning toward him. "Key," Marcus said, the single word flat, controlled. Pike's arms stayed folded. "Procedure," he replied, voice low, almost casual. She was resisting. The air between them thickened. Marcus's stare never broke, his chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. "Key," he repeated, each syllable sharper. Pike didn't move. He reached instead for the radio at his shoulder, pressing the button with lazy precision, speaking in clipped codes that meant nothing to anyone outside the force. Marcus didn't wait. He turned back to Amara, slipping a small multi-tool from his pocket, a habit from years of fixing engines in the field. The sun glinted off the silver as he worked the tip into the locking mechanism. It was a slow process. The street around them so silent that each click inside the cuff felt like a drumbeat. Finally, with a soft snap, the first cuff opened, then the second. The chain fell away from the trunk rail with a metallic clatter that rang down the street. He gathered her up again, the smell of blood more distinct now. Her head rested against his chest, her hair damp against his shirt. His jaw flexed, but his steps stayed measured as he started toward the pickup. Pike shifted just enough to block the way, his presence a deliberate wall. "You might want to wait for backup," he said, almost smirking. Marcus paused, close enough now that the heat radiating off Pike's body mixed with the burning air. He didn't speak, he simply looked at him, long enough that the faint edge of that smirk faltered. Then he stepped past him without breaking stride, the weight in his arms steady, his focus unshaken. Each step toward the truck solidified the line that had just been drawn. It wasn't just between him and Pike, it was between what had just happened and what Marcus was about to do. Marcus eased Amara into the passenger seat of the truck, moving with the precision of someone who understood that sudden motions could do more harm than good. Her breath was shallow, the rise and fall of her chest uneven. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers coming away damp, and for a brief moment he let his hand linger against her cheek. Her eyes fluttered open halfway, the brown of her irises clouded but still holding recognition. She tried to form words again, her lips trembling, but only a thin whisper escaped. Marcus bent closer, his ear nearly touching her mouth. This time he caught it, a single, fragile sentence. "Don't. Let him." The rest dissolved into the heavy air, her voice trailing into silence as her head lolled gently against the seat. Marcus stared at her for a moment, the echo of those words vibrating through him. He shut the truck door with deliberate care, the muted thud sounding final. When he turned, Pike was still there, leaning against his cruiser, arms crossed once more. The sun caught in the pale blue of his eyes, making them look colder, harder. The two men locked eyes again, but now Marcus's gaze was different. Before, it had been the stare of a man assessing an enemy. Now it carried the calm of someone who had made a choice and understood the cost. Pike's jaw shifted, the faintest twitch of a smirk threatening to return, but Marcus didn't flinch. His heartbeat slowed, not because he was settling, but because clarity had burned away everything else. He knew exactly what had been taken from Amara in those few brutal minutes. He also knew what was about to be taken back. Without another word, Marcus climbed into the driver's seat. The truck's engine turned over with a low, steady growl, the kind that seemed to mirror the resolve settling in his chest. He gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes never leaving Pike in the rearview mirror as he pulled away. Each block he drove put more distance between them physically, but in his mind the gap was closing. This wasn't over. Not by miles, not by hours. He replayed the sight of her wrists, the sound of her voice, the flash of satisfaction in Pike's eyes. These weren't memories that would fade, they were markers, guiding him toward what had to happen next. By the time the truck disappeared down the sun-baked road, Marcus wasn't just a husband rushing his wife to safety. He was a man who had just committed to war. The hospital's fluorescent lights were too bright, casting a cold sheen over the white tile floors that seemed to stretch endlessly. The air was thick with the sterile sting of antiseptic, mixed faintly with the sharp tang of industrial cleaner. Marcus sat alone in the hallway, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were pale. Every few seconds, a monitor beeped from behind closed doors, a sound that seemed to measure time in slow, torturous increments. His shirt was still streaked with dust and faint smears of blood, the fabric stiff where it had dried. He stared down at the stains without really seeing them, his mind replaying the last moments in the truck. Amara's whisper still clung to him, fragile yet heavy enough to anchor his every thought. The memory of her limp form burned in his chest, hotter than any anger he'd felt before. Footsteps approached from the far end of the hall. He looked up, his breath hitching despite himself. A doctor in pale blue scrubs, mask lowered around his neck, was walking toward him. The man's eyes flickered down for just a second before meeting Marcus's. That brief glance told Marcus everything. Before a word was spoken, "I'm sorry," the doctor began, voice low but steady. "We did everything we could. The injuries were extensive." He paused, choosing the next words as if they might soften the impact. "She didn't make it." For a moment, Marcus didn't move. The sentence hung in the air between them, suspended and unprocessed. Then it landed, heavy and final, stripping the hallway of sound. His jaw tightened, his shoulders locked, but he didn't speak. The doctor murmured something else, about paperwork, about next steps, but the words didn't penetrate. Marcus rose slowly to his feet, each motion deliberate, as though he was testing the ground beneath him. He walked past the doctor without asking for directions, his steps carrying him to a door marked with a room number he recognized from when they first arrived. His hand hesitated on the handle, fingers curling around the metal as if it might burn. When he pushed the door open, the world seemed to shrink. Amara lay on the bed, her skin pale against the crisp white sheets, the harsh light making her stillness even starker. Her hand rested on top of the blanket, fingers slightly curled. Marcus moved to her side, lowering himself into the chair, and took her hand in his. It was already cool to the touch. Marcus sat beside her in silence, his thumb moving slowly over her knuckles in a rhythm that was more instinct than thought. The chill of her skin seeped into him, pulling the warmth from his own fingers. For a long moment, he just looked at her face, memorizing every line, every curve, as if afraid that grief might blur the details in his mind. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the edge of the bed, and whispered to her like she could still hear him. "I'll make it right," he said, his voice low but solid. "I swear to you, Amara, no matter what it takes, no matter who I have to go through, he will answer for this." The words weren't just a promise. They were a binding oath, the kind that would outlive his grief and shape his every step from here on. The hum of fluorescent lights above filled the silence that followed. In the corner of the room, a heart monitor sat dark and silent, its cables coiled neatly as though waiting for someone else. Marcus felt the finality of that image sink into him, heavier than the air in his lungs. A knock sounded on the door frame, soft at first, but followed by the creak of it opening wider. A nurse stepped in, her eyes kind but cautious. "Mr. Lewis," she said gently, "there are people outside. They've been asking for a statement." The way she said it made him understand she didn't mean family. She meant reporters. Marcus stood, his movements steady, and laid her hand gently back onto the blanket. He brushed her hair once more away from her forehead before straightening and walking out into the corridor. The moment he stepped beyond the double doors, the quiet of the hospital gave way to a low, restless murmur. Outside, the sun was blinding after the cold light inside. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance, camera crews, reporters with notepads, a few curious onlookers. The voices rose as they spotted him, questions thrown at him in quick succession. Was she resisting? Did you see what happened? Do you believe the officer acted within the law? Marcus didn't answer. His eyes scanned past them, already finding the figure he knew would be here. Standing near the edge of the group, in a pressed white shirt and dark tie, was Chief Randall Hayes. His expression was polished, the kind Marcus recognized from years of dealing with men who knew how to speak without saying anything. Chief Randall Hayes stepped forward as if he owned the air between them, the deliberate rhythm of his polished shoes clicking on the pavement drawing every camera his way. He didn't glance at Marcus yet. He was too focused on controlling the stage. The cluster of reporters closed in, holding out microphones, voice recorders, and cameras that blinked red with the quiet hunger for a headline. "This," Hayes began, his voice smooth and solemn, "is a tragic incident, and our hearts go out to the family of Mrs. Lewis." He paused, just long enough for the cameras to drink in his somber face. "The department will conduct a full and fair review to ensure all procedures were followed." Marcus stood just beyond the circle, his hands loose at his sides, though every muscle in his body was wound tight. He caught it instantly: instead of attack, procedures instead of laws. The chief wasn't speaking to comfort anyone, he was laying down the framework for doubt, for excuses. Marcus had seen this kind of game before, when he was in the military. Words chosen to shield the guilty and buy time until public anger cooled. Hayes shifted his stance, tilting his head in a way that suggested openness. "We urge the community to remain calm while we gather all the facts. We know emotions are high, but justice must be done the right way." His hands spread slightly, palms outward, as if to calm a restless crowd. The cameras clicked again, capturing every carefully crafted gesture. The questions came fast. "Chief, do you believe Officer Pike acted appropriately? Is he suspended? Will there be criminal charges?" A woman's voice cut through, sharper than the others. Was she resisting? That one made Marcus's stomach turn. He saw Hayes's eyes flicker just briefly before he answered. "We must avoid speculation at this stage," Hayes said, his tone steady, practiced. "It's important that due process is respected for all involved." He let the phrase "all involved" linger in the air, as if to imply Amara somehow shared blame. Marcus felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. When the chief finally looked at him, it was with a faint, diplomatic nod. "Mr. Lewis, we'll be in touch as the investigation moves forward." It was a dismissal disguised as concern. Marcus said nothing. He simply stared at Hayes, letting the silence speak for him. A few of the reporters sensed the tension and swung their cameras toward Marcus. The lenses glinted in the sun. But he didn't acknowledge them. He kept his eyes on Hayes, unblinking, until the chief's polished composure faltered for a fraction of a second. Then Marcus stepped forward, not toward Hayes, but past him, cutting through the crowd without a word. He ignored the rapid-fire questions that followed, the hands reaching to pull him back into the story they wanted to tell. None of these people were going to give him what he needed. They wanted quotes. He wanted truth. Each step away from the hospital doors was a step into a different world. He understood now with cold certainty that the law wasn't going to save Amara. The system wasn't going to punish Pike. The people in power weren't going to protect the truth. That was his job now. And as he walked, he didn't look back at Hayes. He didn't need to see the chief's confident mask settling back into place. That mask was built on the belief that storms could be contained. Marcus knew better. This one was going to break open, and when it did, it wouldn't be Hayes deciding how it ended. It would be him. The morning sun hung low over Main Street, spilling a pale gold that failed to warm the day. The town's only hearse rolled slowly between the rows of brick storefronts, its polished black surface reflecting the faces of those who lined the sidewalk. Some bowed their heads, others kept their eyes fixed on the passing casket, the hush of the crowd broken only by the soft rumble of the hearse's engine and the shuffle of feet behind it. Marcus walked directly behind, his frame squared, his stride unhurried but deliberate. He wore a dark suit that fit his shoulders like armor, the creases pressed sharp, his hands at his sides. His gaze never left the closed casket ahead, the one they insisted must remain sealed. The injuries Pike had inflicted were too severe, they'd said. They didn't want people remembering Amara like that. Marcus didn't need the reminder. Her final moments were etched into him in colors no eye could see. Women in church hats stood with gloved hands clasped in front of them. Men in work shirts had stopped sweeping their stoops to watch. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, not quite understanding the weight of the air but feeling it nonetheless. Marcus could feel all their eyes, the unspoken question in them. What was he going to do? Halfway down the block, he spotted movement just beyond the crowd's edge. A tall figure leaned casually against a lamppost, arms folded, the badge still gleaming on his chest. Officer Warren Pike. The sunlight caught his face just enough to reveal the curve of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite a sneer, but something in between. It was a look that said he knew exactly where he was standing and exactly who could see him. Marcus's jaw flexed, but his pace didn't change. Pike's pale eyes followed the procession, and for a moment they met Marcus's. There was no flicker of shame, no hint of fear. If anything, Pike's expression deepened, as if silently daring Marcus to break the decorum of the day. The pastor, walking a few steps ahead of Marcus, glanced back as if sensing the invisible current between them. He gave the smallest shake of his head, a reminder to keep moving, to not let the moment unravel here in the street. Marcus didn't nod, didn't speak, but his gaze never broke from Pike's until the hearse turned the corner toward the church. Only then did he look forward again, the image of that smirk burning into the edges of his mind like a brand. Inside, his resolve began to harden. The procession wasn't just about laying Amara to rest. It was about marking the beginning of something else entirely. And Pike, standing smug in the open, had just reminded him exactly why there could be no turning back. The church doors opened wide, letting in the faint scent of lilies mixed with the coolness of polished wood and candle wax. The congregation shuffled inside, their footsteps softened by the thick red carpet. Stained glass windows fractured the morning light into shards of color that danced across the pews, painting the mourners in fleeting blues and reds. Marcus followed the casket down the aisle, his shoes clicking in measured rhythm. The hush inside was almost heavier than the silence on the street. Every breath seemed to be held, every cough or creak magnified in the vaulted space. Amara's photograph sat at the front near the pulpit, her smile captured in a frame edged with gold. It was a younger photo, taken before the years of careful vigilance had carved small lines around her eyes. Marcus's gaze lingered on it a moment longer than he meant to. The pastor, Reverend Ellis, stood waiting. His eyes met Marcus's with a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or sorrow too heavy for words. He stepped aside as the casket was placed before the altar. Marcus took his seat in the front row, his hands resting on his knees, his back straight. From where he sat, he could still see through the open doorway to the street outside, and there, framed perfectly, was Pike's silhouette leaning against the lamppost. The silhouette reflected against the lamppost. Reverend Ellis began the service with a reading from the Psalms, his voice steady but low. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." His words rolled through the air, touching each bowed head. But Marcus wasn't hearing scripture the way everyone else did. The valley he walked in had a name. The evil had a face. When the pastor began to speak on the sins of silence, his voice took on a weight that made some in the congregation shift in their seats. He spoke of the duty to stand against wrong, even when it was dangerous, even when the price was dear. Silence, he said, is the accomplice of cruelty. Marcus felt those words lodge in his chest like a stone. He glanced again toward the doorway. Pike was gone, but the shadow he left in Marcus's mind was darker than before. The pastor's voice softened, calling for anyone who wished to speak to come forward. The room stayed still, the weight of grief keeping most people anchored to their seats. Then Marcus rose. The scrape of the pew against the floor seemed to echo like a warning. Heads turned, eyes widened. Even Reverend Ellis stepped back, his hands folding before him. Marcus took the first step toward the pulpit, the slow, deliberate rhythm of his walk carrying more force than any words yet spoken. Marcus stood at the pulpit, his hands resting on either side of the worn wood. The microphone caught his steady breathing before he spoke. He looked out over the sea of faces, friends, neighbors, people who had known Amara since she was a girl. Some couldn't meet his eyes. Others stared back with expressions caught between sympathy and fear, as if they already sensed what was coming. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't search for the right words. When he spoke, his voice was low but unshakable, carrying the weight of a man who had already made up his mind. "They took her from me in daylight," he said. The sentence fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every heart. "And they did it knowing we would all see." A few murmurs broke the quiet, but Marcus didn't pause. "Some of you watched, some of you heard. Some of you saw what they did to her and stayed behind your windows. I'm not here to shame you for that. I understand fear. I've known it myself." His gaze swept the room. "But I'm telling you now, fear won't protect you, not from men like him." His hand tightened on the edge of the pulpit. The tendons in his forearm flexed, the only outward sign of the storm building inside him. "I will return the favor." Gasps rippled through the pews. A few people exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Reverend Ellis's eyes closed briefly, his lips moving as if in silent prayer. But Marcus's gaze never wavered. He was looking past the congregation, past the walls of the church, as if his eyes could reach the man who had done this. I'm not speaking in riddles, Marcus continued. This is not forgiveness. This is not waiting for justice to arrive in neat little paperwork stamped by the same system that let this happen. This is me telling you, there will be no peace until it's made right. The air in the church thickened, heavy enough to feel in the lungs. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, its fading cry the only sound that dared to interrupt him. Marcus stepped back from the pulpit without another word. He didn't need to say more. The vow hung in the room like the toll of a heavy bell, impossible to ignore and impossible to forget. Every person present knew it wasn't an empty threat. The man who had just spoken would follow through. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and steel shavings, the familiar sense of Marcus's years as a mechanic. But tonight, the space didn't feel like a workshop. It felt like a war room. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a yellow cone of light over the workbench. Beneath it lay a large map of the county, its surface creased from years folded in a glove compartment. Red X's marked intersections, alleyways, and service roads, each one carefully placed after hours of memory work and quiet observation. Pinned to the corkboard above the map were photographs, some grainy and pulled from old news clippings, others snapped from Marcus's phone with the patience of a hunter tracking prey. Faces of uniformed men stared back at him. Officer Pike at the center, flanked by the others who had stood silent or helped twist the truth. Their eyes, frozen in still images, looked smug in the safety they believed their badges provided. Marcus's hands moved methodically, not rushed. He pulled a length of heavy chain from under the bench, its links clinking as they dropped into a coil. Beside it, he placed a roll of duct tape, the kind that stuck to your fingers even before you tore it. Then came a folding knife, the blade clean and sharp, clicking into place with a solid final sound. He checked each item as if inventorying tools before a job, but the job tonight wasn't repair, it was reckoning. A black leather notebook lay open on the corner of the bench. Inside, a list of names filled the lined pages, written in the tight, controlled hand of someone who intended no mistakes. Each name had a note beside it, where they lived, when they worked, what routes they took home, who they drank with, who they feared. It wasn't just a list, it was a ledger, each entry a debt that demanded to be collected. He ran a finger slowly down the page until he stopped at the first name. Patrolman Greg Halverson, the man who had falsified the incident report, erasing Pike's brutality in favor of lies that made Amara the aggressor. Marcus remembered seeing him smirking outside the station 2 days after Amara's death, laughing with another officer like nothing had happened. That memory alone could have lit the fuse, but Marcus wasn't here for impulsive fire. He was here to burn the whole rot out with precision. The duffel bag sat open at his feet, half-packed. Inside were gloves, a black hoodie, the chain, the tape, and a flashlight with a red lens to keep light from spilling too far in the dark. Marcus placed each item inside with care, closing the zipper halfway, ready for the morning that would start the storm. The night outside was quiet, but he knew that calm wouldn't last. It never did. Marcus sat at the workbench, elbows planted, eyes fixed on the map. His mind wasn't drifting, it was locking onto patterns. He traced the roads with his finger, marking the quickest routes in and out of the town without being seen by Pike's allies. He knew their habits better than they realized. Patrol shifts changed every 8 hours, but some officers were lazy about time, lingering over coffee or killing a few minutes at the gas station. Those gaps mattered. Those gaps would keep him moving unseen. He reached for the manila folder tucked beneath the map. Inside were more photographs. Grainy shots of vehicles, license plates, and houses taken from just far enough away to avoid suspicion. Patrolman Halverson's beat-up silver sedan was easy to spot in the photos. Its dented front fender had been there for months, never repaired. Marcus knew exactly where it sat most nights, parked under the dim streetlight outside Halverson's duplex, the one with the peeling paint and the broken porch rail. He wrote a single word in the margin next to Halverson's name: tonight. The weight of that word pressed on him, but not with doubt. He had been a soldier long before he was a husband. In the military, missions came with a clarity that civilian life rarely offered. Objectives, steps, outcomes. This was no different, except now, the mission's success wasn't measured in enemy positions taken or intel retrieved. It was measured in the restoration of something stolen. Amara's dignity, her life cut short. Marcus turned to a second page in the notebook, labeled with a bold header: routes and timings. Every move he made from this point would have to be deliberate. Too fast, and he'd draw attention. Too slow, and the element of surprise would vanish. He penciled in the sequence: when to leave, when to cut the lights on the truck, when to approach the duplex, where to park so no one would see. On the bench, the chain gleamed faintly under the single bulb. He picked it up, the weight settling into his palm like something alive. This wasn't for show, it was a message. Every link was a reminder that the law had chained Amara for daring to exist in her own town, and now he would turn that symbol back on them. He packed the chain into the duffel bag, followed by the duct tape, wrapping it tight so it wouldn't unravel in the dark. The folding knife went into a side pocket, within easy reach. He tested the zipper. Smooth. No snag. The bag was almost ready, but Marcus wasn't rushing. The last step was to prepare himself, to settle the storm raging in his chest, so when the time came, he'd move like water. Quiet, inevitable, unstoppable. The wall clock ticked in the background. Midnight wasn't far. He glanced once more at the list. Tonight was Halverson. Tomorrow, another name would get its turn. Marcus stepped out into the cool night air, the kind that carried every sound farther than it should. The garage door slid shut behind him with a muted clank, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. He stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the moonlight, listening for any hint that someone might be watching. Only the hum of distant cicadas and the faint creak of a porch swing reached his ears. The duffel bag sat in the bed of his pickup, its contents arranged so nothing would shift. Marcus had learned long ago that noise could give a man away faster than light. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the key just far enough to start the engine without flooding the silence, and eased down the long gravel drive. Every bump was memorized. He'd grown up on this land, every rut and divot as familiar as the lines in his own hands. When he reached the main road, he killed the headlights. The moon was enough. His truck rolled forward like a shadow, tires whispering over the pavement. He could see the glow of town up ahead, faint and flickering through the trees. Beyond that glow was Halverson's duplex, and beyond that, the next step in his plan. The bag wasn't the only thing he carried tonight. Folded in the breast pocket of his jacket was a photograph. Amara on their front porch, leaning on the railing, laughing at something he'd said. Her hair caught the sunlight that day, turning it into a halo. He touched the edge of the photo, feeling the worn crease from where he'd folded it years ago to fit in his wallet. That image was the last thing he wanted burned into his mind before he made his move. He passed by the darkened diner on Main Street, the same place Pike and his crew liked to drink coffee late into their shifts. Marcus slowed just enough to scan the parking lot. No cruiser, no danger here. He pressed on, the truck blending into the spaces between street lamps. By the time he reached the outskirts of Halverson's neighborhood, he knew every house was asleep. The silence was different here, heavier, as if the air itself was holding secrets. He parked 2 blocks away, under the shadow of a large oak. From there, he could approach on foot without drawing attention. Marcus slung the duffel bag over his shoulder, its weight steady and familiar. Every step toward the duplex was calculated, his boots falling silently on the cracked sidewalk. The pale glow of the streetlight outside Halverson's home grew brighter with each stride, illuminating the dented sedan exactly where Marcus had expected it to be. He didn't rush. The night was on his side, and time belonged to him now. Halverson's name was the first on the list for a reason. By the time the sun rose, that name would be crossed out in thick, permanent ink. The diner's neon sign buzzed in the early dawn, casting a sickly pink glow on the empty street. Marcus parked 2 spaces from the door, engine idling just long enough for him to scan the inside through the big front window. The patrolman was there, Halverson. Slouched in a booth at the far corner with his hat pushed back, nursing a mug of coffee, the man's shoulders were hunched in the way of someone who thought the night was already won, and his guard was down. Marcus cut the engine, stepped out, and let the door's bell jingle announce him. The air inside smelled of burnt bacon and overbrewed coffee, the kind that clung to clothes for hours. A waitress with tired eyes gave him a polite nod from behind the counter, but he didn't respond. His attention was fixed on the man at the booth. Halverson looked up when Marcus slid into the seat across from him. Confusion flashed for half a second before being replaced by a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're Marcus Lewis," he said, as if testing the name. Marcus didn't answer right away. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was the same one he had touched in the truck earlier. Amara, on their porch, laughing. He set it on the table, sliding it across until it rested between the two of them. His hand lingered on the edge before he pulled it back. Halverson's gaze dropped to the picture, and for a moment he looked as though he might feign sympathy, but Marcus saw the shift, the calculation, the avoidance. "Tragic," Halverson muttered, "but accidents happen." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Accidents don't come with falsified reports." His voice was low, deliberate, each word a nail in the patrolman's coffin. The smirk returned, though thinner this time. Halverson didn't bother denying it. That alone told Marcus everything he needed to know. He leaned back, his hand sliding under the table. The folding knife clicked open with a sound so soft it was almost swallowed by the diner's hum. Halverson's eyes darted down a split second before Marcus struck. The blade moved in a precise arc, finding the seam between fabric and flesh beneath the table's edge. A sharp intake of breath from Halverson was the only sound he made before his coffee mug rattled against the formica. Marcus withdrew the blade just as quickly, his movements controlled, measured. He reached for the photograph, wiped the edge of the table with a napkin, and set the picture down beside the steaming coffee mug. It sat there like a quiet witness. Without a word, Marcus slid out of the booth, dropped a few bills on the table for the coffee he never touched, and walked out into the pink glow of morning. His stride was calm, almost casual, but his heartbeat was steady with purpose. The door's bell jingled behind Marcus as he stepped back into the morning air, the crisp chill cutting through the faint haze of diner grease clinging to his jacket. He didn't glance over his shoulder, didn't slow his pace. Inside, Halverson's muffled groan was swallowed by the hum of the place, the clink of dishes, and the sizzle from the kitchen. No one came running after him, no one asked questions. That was the way this town worked. Eyes averted, mouths shut. The gravel crunched under his boots as he reached the truck. He opened the door, slid in, and took one last look at the diner through the windshield. Halverson hadn't moved from the booth, his shoulders curled inward now, his head bowed. The steam from his coffee still drifted upward, untouched. Marcus started the engine, the rumble vibrating through the steering wheel into his hands. He reached across the bench seat for the small spiral notebook lying beside his duffel bag. The names were written in block letters, each one etched with the precision of someone who never forgot a detail. Halverson's name was first. He pulled a black marker from the cup holder and drew a single, deliberate line through it. The sound of the cap snapping back onto the marker echoed in the quiet cab. He didn't smile, didn't speak. There was no satisfaction yet, only the confirmation that the path he'd chosen was now irreversible. One name gone, more to follow. He placed the notebook back on the seat, shifted into gear, and eased the truck onto the road. The sun was rising higher now, bathing the cracked asphalt in gold. But to Marcus, it felt like nothing had changed. Amara's absence was still a hollow weight pressing against his ribs, a space that would never be filled. As he drove, the radio crackled to life. A calm newsreader's voice filled the cabin, talking about the funeral from 2 days ago, about the incident under investigation. Not once did they say Pike's name, not once did they speak Amara's full story. The words were sterile, stripped of blood and screams. It was the same voice he'd been hearing since that day, polished, distant, and wrong. Marcus reached forward and shut it off. The silence was better. In silence, he could hear the faint rattle of the chain in the duffel bag, the shifting weight of the tools he'd prepared. They were reminders that he was ready for the next step. He took the long way home, passing by the alley behind the station where Pike sometimes parked. Empty now. That was fine. Marcus wasn't ready for Pike yet. Not until the others had paid. Marcus drove until the diner was a memory in the rearview mirror, the faint glimmer of its neon sign shrinking until it disappeared entirely. The road ahead was long and straight, lined with bare pecan trees that reached toward the pale winter sky like skeletal fingers. The monotony of the landscape gave his mind room to move, backward, forward, never resting. He thought of Amara's voice, the way she used to hum under her breath while making coffee in the mornings. He thought of how she'd squeeze his hand when crossing the street, even though she knew he didn't need guiding. It was her way of keeping him close, of reminding him they were moving together. The empty space beside him in the truck seat was more than just physical. It was the cold void of every small comfort stolen. By the time he reached the edge of town, he'd pulled off onto a dirt track that led to a clearing by the river. It was secluded here, far from prying eyes. He parked, cut the engine, and sat in the stillness. The rush of the current filled the air, mixing with the faint rattle of the tools in his duffel. He reached over, unzipped it, and pulled out the spiral notebook once more. The next name stared up at him. Deputy Carl Minter. The one who'd been first on scene, the one who'd written a report so full of lies it might as well have been fiction. Minter had claimed Amara had resisted, that her injuries were the result of an unfortunate struggle. Every word had been chosen to shield Pike and bury the truth. Marcus closed the notebook and set it back on the seat. He didn't need to stare at the name to remember it. Every letter was etched into him now. The weight of the promise he'd made at the church still sat heavy in his chest. They took her from me in daylight. I will return the favor. He leaned back, eyes closing for a moment, and pictured the next meeting. Different location, different approach, but the same intent. Each step had to be precise, each move calculated. This wasn't rage for rage's sake. This was the slow turning of a wheel that would crush every man who had stood by, watched, or helped cover it up. When he opened his eyes again, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, casting the water in streaks of orange and red. It reminded him uncomfortably of blood in the light. He started the engine again, the sound breaking the stillness, and turned back toward the road. One name was gone. The next would follow soon, and Pike would be last. Not because Marcus feared him, but because saving him for the end would make every step toward that moment heavier, sharper, and impossible to escape. The night was cold and moonless, the kind of darkness that swallows headlights before they can stretch more than a few yards ahead. Marcus sat in his truck on the shoulder of County Road 14, engine idling low, his eyes fixed on the bend a quarter-mile down. He had driven this stretch dozens of times over the past week, studying the angles, memorizing the dips in the shoulder where a vehicle might vanish from sight. Tonight wasn't about improvisation. It was about control. In the bed of the truck lay the chain, heavy and cold even through the tarp. Next to it sat a claw hammer, a strip of leather, and an old roofing nail with a flat, battered head. The badge he'd taken earlier that day glinted faintly in the dim dashboard light. That badge was more than a piece of metal. It was a symbol that these men hid behind, something they wore like armor. Tonight, Marcus planned to strip that armor away in the most visible way possible. The target was Deputy Carl Minter. Marcus had followed him for 2 days now, learning his routine. Minter worked the late shift, often taking the long route home after his patrol, cutting through this empty road to avoid traffic. Marcus knew he liked the quiet. He also knew Minter would be alone. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, the sweep of headlights carving the curve. Marcus cut his engine, stepped out into the cold, and pulled the chain from the truck bed. His boots crunched on the gravel as he crossed the road, moving fast but quiet. He looped the chain around the base of an old telephone pole and held the other end loose in his hands. The cruiser came into view, slowing just slightly as Minter spotted Marcus standing in the middle of the road. His hand likely went to the radio, but Marcus knew there was no time for backup to reach him. Minter stepped out, hand hovering near his holster, the beam of the cruiser's spotlight slicing across Marcus's face. "You lost?" Minter asked, his voice carrying that lazy, smug tone Marcus had heard before. Marcus didn't answer. He let the chain slip through his fingers until the steel links clinked against the asphalt. Then he moved 2 steps forward, a sudden grab at Minter's wrist, twisting it until the man's grip faltered. The chain snaked around him in seconds, the cold bite of metal drawing a grunt of pain. Marcus looped it twice, securing Minter's arms tight against his sides, then hauled him backward toward the telephone pole. Minter cursed, his boots scraping on the asphalt. Marcus ignored him, securing the last length of chain and locking it into place with a snap of the padlock. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the badge, and held it up so Minter could see it glint under the cruiser's light. "This doesn't belong to you anymore," Marcus said quietly. Marcus stepped in close, so close that Minter could smell the faint mix of motor oil and steel on his jacket. Without breaking eye contact, he lifted the roofing nail, placed the badge flat against the wooden pole just above Minter's head, and drove the metal home with 2 solid strikes of the hammer. Each blow rang out sharp in the stillness, a sound that carried in the night air like a warning. The badge caught the glow from the cruiser's headlights, its polished surface glinting above the deputy's restrained body. Marcus made sure it was nailed high enough so Minter had to crane his neck to see it, high enough that anyone passing by would notice the humiliation before they noticed the man himself. "It won't change the past," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, each word deliberate. "But it will change you." Minter's breath quickened. He tried to mask the fear with defiance, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You're gonna regret this, Lewis. You think you can—" Marcus cut him off with silence, letting the moment stretch, forcing Minter to stand there in the cold with nothing but the hum of the cruiser's engine and the creak of the chain around his body. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as a pickup approached. Marcus stepped back, slipping into the shadows at the roadside. The truck slowed when the driver saw the scene, an officer chained to a telephone pole, his badge hammered above him like a trophy. The driver's brake lights flared, and Marcus knew the image would be burned into the man's mind long enough to retell it 100 times over. Marcus didn't need to stay and watch. He wanted the story to spread on its own, to take root in the gossip that traveled faster than any official report. This wasn't just about punishing Minter. It was about dismantling the untouchable image these men had built for themselves. The sight of one of their own standing shackled beneath his badge would chip away at that illusion far better than any courtroom ever could. He walked calmly back to his truck, boots crunching over gravel, the cold biting deeper now. He didn't look over his shoulder when he started the engine. Minter's muffled curses followed him for a moment before the sound was swallowed by the growl of the truck pulling away. The road ahead was empty, stretching into the night. Marcus drove without the radio, letting the quiet settle in. He could already see the next step forming in his mind, the next name on the list, waiting to be crossed off. Tonight was just the beginning, and the message had been sent. By morning, the image had already taken on a life of its own. Cell phone videos flooded social media, grainy footage of Minter chained to the pole, the badge nailed high above his head gleaming under the harsh beam of headlights. People in town whispered about it over coffee, their voices low but tinged with something Marcus recognized: relief. Someone was finally doing what the system refused to do. Marcus sat in his kitchen with the blinds half closed, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the replay on a muted television screen. The news anchor called it a disturbing act of vigilantism, but couldn't hide the edge of curiosity in her tone. They showed the badge more than they showed Minter's face, as if even the station understood the symbolism. He wasn't interested in the media spin, he was interested in the reaction. Every time the image played, every time the badge glinted in the light, he imagined another officer seeing it and feeling that pit open in their stomach. They would wonder if they were next. That fear was worth more than any weapon he could carry. By mid-morning, the sheriff's department had released a statement, condemning the act and promising to bring the perpetrator to justice. Marcus smirked at the phrasing. The same men who falsified reports, who protected Pike after Amara's death, now pretended to stand for justice. He knew their words were for the cameras, not for truth. He rinsed out his coffee mug, the faint ring of dark liquid swirling down the drain, and went to the garage. The map on the wall waited for him, red X's marking each name. Minter's photo had a single, clean line drawn through it now. Marcus tapped the next face, his finger resting there for a moment as he recalled the man's part in the cover-up, a dispatcher who had rerouted the 911 calls away from any unit that might intervene that day. The duffel bag lay open on the workbench. He methodically checked his supplies, not with the urgency of a man rushing into danger, but with the calm precision of someone assembling an engine. Every piece had its place. Every tool had a purpose. Outside, a breeze rattled the siding, carrying with it the faint hum of traffic on the highway. Life in the town went on as usual for most, but for the men on his list, normalcy had already begun to fracture. They could try to hide behind their uniforms, their titles, their connections. It wouldn't matter. Marcus zipped the duffel shut and set it by the door. The sun was climbing higher now, casting long, sharp shadows across the driveway. Somewhere out there, the next name on his list was going about his day, unaware of how quickly everything could change. That ignorance wouldn't last long. The lumberyard sat at the edge of town like an abandoned skeleton, stacks of weathered planks leaning under the weight of years, their gray edges curling from sun and rain. Marcus had chosen it for its seclusion. No one came here after dark, and by the time the sun slid low enough to bathe the place in copper light, he was already inside, waiting. On the far side of the yard, the rumble of a truck approached. Marcus had been certain Pike's ally, Sergeant Alan Brewer, would take the bait. A phone call from a payphone, a few carefully chosen words, enough to suggest Marcus had information Pike wouldn't want anyone else to hear. Brewer's loyalty to Pike was reflexive. He would come, and he did. The truck rolled through the open gate, headlights sweeping across the yard. Brewer stepped out, boots crunching over gravel, his heavy frame silhouetted against the fading sun. He wore his badge like a shield, clipped to his belt, and his hand rested close to his sidearm. His head was on a swivel, scanning, cautious. Marcus stepped from behind a stack of lumber, silent enough that Brewer didn't notice until the distance between them had closed to 20 feet. "You looking for me, Brewer?" Marcus's voice cut through the quiet, low but steady. Brewer stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can scare me, Lewis? You think chaining up Minter made you some kind of hero? You're just a thug playing soldier." Marcus didn't rise to the insult. He kept walking, slow and deliberate, until they were just a few steps apart. "I'm not here to play. I'm here because you stood there and watched her die." Brewer's jaw clenched, but there was a flicker, brief and involuntary, behind his eyes. It was enough. Marcus motioned toward a cleared patch in the yard where the dust swirled in the faint wind. "Stand there," he said. Brewer snorted, shaking his head. "You've lost your mind." Marcus's hand moved to the duffel at his feet, pulling out the length of chain he'd brought. The metallic rattle seemed louder than it should have in the open air. "Stand there," Marcus repeated, his tone unchanged, but sharper. There was a long pause, the air thick with the hum of distant cicadas. Finally, Brewer moved. Less out of fear, more out of a grudging awareness that Marcus wasn't bluffing. He stopped where Marcus had pointed, the place where the dirt was darker from old oil stains, and shadows fell in jagged patterns across the ground. "This is where she stood," Marcus said quietly. "Right here. She was breathing, bleeding, and you looked away." Brewer's gaze flickered to the ground, then back to Marcus. "I didn't kill her," he muttered, but the edge in his voice was gone. Marcus stepped closer until they were eye to eye. "But you didn't save her, either." Brewer's eyes darted to the side, scanning for an opening, but Marcus closed the space, his shadow falling over him. The late evening light sharpened the lines of Marcus's face, making his expression unreadable, almost carved from stone. "You think I don't know what you did after—" Marcus's voice was steady, every word measured. "You rewrote the report. You erased her screams from the record. You made it look like she attacked Pike. And you slept that night like nothing happened." Brewer's mouth tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I do," Marcus said. "I know the ink you used. I know the times you changed. I know you deleted the dashcam file. You made her death clean on paper so you could keep your badge shiny." For the first time, Brewer's gaze faltered. His shoulders sagged just enough to betray the weight he carried, but it was gone in a flash, replaced by that same defensive scowl. "You don't get it, Lewis. You go against Pike, you're done. I've seen what happens to people who try." Marcus took a slow step closer, the chain in his hands hanging loose but heavy. "You think I'm worried about what happens to me? They already took everything from me. You can't threaten a man who's got nothing left to lose." The silence stretched, broken only by the faint groan of lumber shifting in the wind. Brewer's breathing was louder now, more uneven, like the walls he'd built were starting to crack. "Say it," Marcus said, his voice dropping low. "Say what you did." Brewer looked at the ground. "I." His jaw worked, as if the words were caught in his throat. "I didn't touch her, Lewis. I swear I didn't." "But—" "I didn't stop him. I didn't call it in the way I should have. I helped him write it up. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to confirm the truth Marcus already knew. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and ugly. "You stood there," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and let the life drain out of her." Brewer's head dropped, and for a moment it seemed he might say more, might spill everything. But the moment passed, and his face hardened again. "It's not that simple," he muttered. Marcus's grip on the chain tightened. "It's exactly that simple." The air shifted, colder now even in the fading light. Marcus didn't move yet, he just stood there, the tension coiling tighter, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on the man who had helped erase Amara from the world. Brewer's last words barely faded before Marcus stepped forward, the sound of his boots on the lumberyard floor echoing like a countdown. Brewer straightened instinctively, but there was no fight in his posture, just the tremor of someone who knew the end had already arrived. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph. He didn't hold it out, didn't shove it in Brewer's face. He simply laid it on a stack of pine boards between them. It was Amara, smiling in the sunlight, hair tousled by the wind, a hand shielding her eyes from the glare. Brewer's gaze flickered to it and away again. "You'll look at her," Marcus said. "You'll look at the woman you watched die, and remember that moment every time you close your eyes." Brewer's chest rose and fell quickly now, each breath shallow. "I told you what happened," he said, voice cracking just slightly. "You told me half," Marcus replied, his tone as cold as the air between them. "But half the truth won't bring her back." The chain in Marcus's hand rattled softly as he wrapped it once, twice around his palm. He didn't rush. This wasn't about rage anymore. It was about resolution. Brewer's back pressed lightly against a vertical beam, the rough wood digging into his jacket. He didn't move away. Marcus stepped in until their shoulders were nearly touching. His free hand moved with slow precision, unclipping the badge from Brewer's chest. The metal caught the dying light, a brief flash before Marcus let it fall. It landed on the dusty floor with a dull, final clink. "You don't deserve this," Marcus said. "Not anymore." Brewer's lips parted, as if to argue, but nothing came. His throat worked around the words he couldn't form. The lumberyard around them seemed to hold its breath. Marcus's arm moved once, sharp, decisive, and Brewer folded, the fight gone before it could start. He slumped to the side, the badge lying just inches from his open hand. Marcus crouched briefly, picking up the badge again. He set it atop the photograph on the boards, the two symbols side by side. The life that had been stolen and the authority that had betrayed it. He turned without looking back, boots crunching over grit and sawdust. The air outside was cooler, touched with the faint scent of rain. As he stepped into the open, the last of the daylight faded into a deep, rich blue. Behind him, the lumber yard returned to its stillness, holding its secrets. Ahead of him, the road curved into shadow, and Marcus walked into it with the slow, unshakable stride of a man whose path was already set. The last name on Marcus's list had been circled in red for days. It was Pike's last loyal enforcer, the one who had driven the cruiser the day Amara was dragged down Main Street, the man who had kept his eyes fixed forward while her screams tore through the air, hands steady on the wheel as if nothing in the world was wrong. Marcus didn't need to hunt him quietly. This one would be taken where everyone could see. It happened in the late afternoon when the town was caught between the lethargy of heat and the restless stirrings before nightfall. The officer's shift had just ended, his uniform still crisp, his duty belt still snug at his waist. He stepped out of the station, head down, thumbing his phone. He didn't notice the black pickup rolling slow across the lot until it was too close to avoid. Marcus stepped out before the man could react, his boots hitting the asphalt with deliberate, measured force. There was no mask, no pretense of hiding. His eyes locked on the officers, and in that instant the man froze. Marcus reached for him with the same inevitability as gravity itself, yanking him forward with a force that sent his phone skittering across the pavement. In seconds, the rope was around his wrists. The officer's voice cracked in a half-formed protest, but Marcus didn't slow. He moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. The rope wound tight, loop after loop, binding the man's hands behind him and then pulling them upward until his shoulders strained. By now, the sound had drawn attention. First, a couple of pedestrians paused on the sidewalk, eyes widening. Then a car slowed at the curb. Someone pulled out a phone. The small lot in front of the station began to fill with people, the kind of quiet that comes from shock, replacing the usual murmur of the street. Marcus dragged the man toward the open center of the lot, stopping where the afternoon sun cut long shadows across the concrete. The officer stumbled, nearly falling, but Marcus's grip on the rope never wavered. He forced him into position, standing straight, the rope cinched to a metal post that had once held a flag. The crowd thickened, their whispers gathering like wind through leaves. Some recognized Marcus immediately, their expressions shifting between awe and fear. Others recognized the officer, their eyes narrowing, memories of his past cruelty surfacing like oil on water. Marcus stepped back, letting the scene breathe. He looked at the man he had bound, then at the faces encircling them both. His voice was low but carried, each word sharp enough to cut the warm air. "You all saw what he did," Marcus said. "You all heard the lies that followed. Today you hear the truth." The murmurs in the crowd stilled, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Marcus took a folded sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and held it up so everyone could see. It was a copy of the falsified incident report from the day Amara died. The ink was smeared in places, but the lies were still clear. Phrases like "suspect resisted" and "necessary force applied" stood out like wounds on the page. "This," Marcus said, his voice rising, "is the story they told you. A story that says she fought them, that she brought it on herself, that her life didn't matter." He stepped closer to the officer, his shadow falling across the man's face. "But I was there, and so were you." His gaze swept over the crowd. "You saw her scream, you saw her beg, you saw them laugh." The officer's lips tightened, his eyes darting toward the growing semicircle of townspeople. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. Marcus tilted his head, studying him, then pulled a small recorder from his pocket. He clicked it on and held it inches from the officer's mouth. "Say it," Marcus demanded. "Tell them what you did." The man's chest rose and fell rapidly, but no words came. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't need to. The silence was heavier than any threat. People in the crowd leaned in, phones raised, their lenses capturing every second. Marcus glanced at a woman near the front, someone he recognized from the grocery store. "Do you remember Amara?" he asked her. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "Do you remember the sound of her voice that day?" Another nod, more certain this time. Marcus turned back to the officer. "She can still hear it. I can still hear it. And now, so will you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, the same one he had carried since the day after she died. It showed Amara standing on their porch, her hair loose around her shoulders, sunlight catching in her eyes. Marcus held it up to the officer's face. So close, the man flinched. "This is who you destroyed," Marcus said. His voice cracked, but he steadied it. "Not a suspect, not a threat. My wife." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Though many already knew, it was one thing to hear it in whispers, it was another to have the truth spoken plainly in the open air, with the guilty man standing bound before them. Marcus stepped back again, folding the photo carefully and slipping it away. The officer shifted uncomfortably, the rope biting into his wrists. The heat pressed down on all of them, but no one moved. "This ends today," Marcus said, his voice carrying through the lot. "Not just for me, for all of us." Marcus stepped aside, letting the crowd have an unbroken view of the man in the center. The rope held him upright, but the weight of what had been said seemed to pull him down. Murmurs ran through the gathered people. Some whispered in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they wanted to be witnesses to what came next. An older man in a faded cap stepped forward. "I remember her," he said, voice trembling. "She brought soup to my wife when she was sick. Didn't even know us that well, but she came anyway." A woman with a stroller spoke up next. "She held my baby at the market so I could reach for bread. She smiled the whole time." Bit by bit, more voices joined in, small stories weaving together, until they formed something unbreakable. Proof that Amara's life had been worth more than the lies in the report. The officer's eyes darted from one speaker to another, his jaw clenched, but his defiance faltered. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He only watched, arms folded, as the truth gathered like a storm. When the last voice quieted, Marcus took a step forward. "You hear them?" he asked the officer. "That's who you answered to today, not me. Them." With that, Marcus reached up and untied the rope, but he didn't free the man completely. Instead, he left the length coiled around his wrists, a visible reminder of the moment. He turned and began to walk toward the edge of the lot, the crowd parting for him. No one stopped him. No one dared. Halfway to the street, he paused. "I kept my word," he said, softly, but loud enough for those nearest to hear. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple truth, a promise fulfilled. Weeks later, the empty lot was unrecognizable. Neighbors had cleared the trash and planted flowers. A patch near the center bloomed with lilies, white and gold, swaying gently in the wind. People said they grew fast, almost too fast, as if the earth itself wanted to make the place right. Marcus visited only once, early in the morning before the sun was high. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, the hum of the town just waking up around him. "I kept my word," he whispered again, this time to the flowers. The wind moved through them, a soft rustle like a reply. He left without ceremony, walking into a day that would be like any other, except for the fact that justice, messy, imperfect, and heavy with cost, had been done. And for those who had watched and remembered, silence would never again feel like safety.